Well, a big hello to everyone and thank you for joining this webinar. I've got a fantastic panel, which I'm going to introduce you to one at a time. We are focusing in this webinar on women in finance, and we're doing that because in 2016, the Treasury launched the Women in Finance Charter. Now, it had some big aims, the aim of trying to see gender balance at all levels across financial services firms. It also required that there would be an executive responsible for gender diversity and inclusion, someone who was supposed to be making it all happen, the setting of internal targets for senior management, the publication of progress, and also there was an intention to amend the gender pay gaps that were found within the finance industry. So now is a terrific moment to say, from 2016 to here, how are we doing? What progress has been made? What more needs to be done? But the panel that's joining me will be examining those questions. I'm going to turn to each of them for a short presentation. We will then have a conversation and open it up to you for your questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function. We won't be able to get to everybody's question, but we will do the best that we can. Let me introduce to you our first panellist, who is Dr. Ylva Bäckström, who is a lecturer in banking and finance at King's Business School. Her research and teaching interests are in behavioural finance, investment decision-making and investment advice, with a special interest in gender and the interplay between financial advisors and investors. Ylva, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be here today to share with you our latest report called The Visibility of Women in the UK Business and Finance Press. Now, I would like to firstly acknowledge that the analysis has been expertly conducted by my colleague Laura Jones, who's not speaking today, but she's very much behind making this research possible. So to start us off with, we all know that women are severely underrepresented in terms of senior leadership positions in finance and in business in general, and that we are underpaid relative to men. Of course, we now have Alison Rose and Jen Fraser, but these are two women and they make history through their appointments. Now, in order to conduct our analysis, we wanted to find out whether or not women are also underrepresented in the written press in the UK. In order to do this, we analysed over 500,000 articles from the Business, Money and Politics section of The Guardian and from the Financial Times, The Economist and the City AM. We looked for female pronouns in general related to specific topics and to certain professions. We also looked for opinions expressed by women. Now, the bad news is that women appear in the press far less than men. In fact, we get less than 1/5 of the space. The analysis that we conducted in The Guardian showed that women are only represented 17% of the time. When we then looked at the financial press, the Financial Times, The Economist and City AM, the number increased slightly to 18%, still very low numbers. So then we looked back over history to see whether things got any better. In The Guardian, we were able to go back to the year 2000. And as we can see here, if you look at the purple line, in the business section, women had 8% mentions in 2000, slightly increasing throughout the years to 17% in 2020. You will clearly see a Theresa May spike in the politics section of the newspaper during her reign. And we can see in the money section, which talks a lot about personal finances and more relatable topics, perhaps, that there is a higher representation of women than in the business sections. But it's very little progress. So from 8% in 2000 to 17% in 2020 is just not fast enough. At this pace, it will take another 60 years to reach gender parity in terms of press presence. So when we compare this to who's the boss, if we look at the positions that women are held, 32% of the senior management positions in the Women in Finance Charter signature firms are held by women. 23% of board positions across the financial sector are held by women, and 20% of executive committee positions in a financial services firm are held by women. Now, why are these women not in the papers? That's the question. So the problem is that if we don't role model women in the financial press, we don't showcase that successful women can have a voice. And this is quite a serious problem. We don't make it normal for women to be heard. Now, we looked at this analysis a little bit more. So now we want to see about opinions made by men and women. We looked at sayings like he told, he argued, he explained. We then thought about she added, she told, she argued. We now note there is hardly any change at all. Male voices dominate. In over 80% of the cases, men are heard, their opinions are voiced. And this is despite having a higher representation of women in business. So why are these women not in the press? Why are they not heard? And when they are in the press, why are their voices not valued? You will see the full report. In our report, you see the full research that we've conducted. And these are obviously just some highlights. But this role modeling that I'm talking about of successful women is essential. It challenges stereotypes that finance leadership and success are for men, to normalize that these are also female domains. It makes careers in finance and the consumption of financial services accessible to women. We need to see an over, not an under representation of women in the written press. The media has a really important role to play here. Thank you. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Ylva. Thank you for that fascinating analysis. Plenty to talk about there. But before we get to the discussion points, I'm going to turn to our next panelist for a presentation, to Yasmin Chinwalla, who is a partner at New Financial. New Financial contributed data to the government-backed review of senior women in the UK financial services sector, and is working with Treasury to conduct an annual review of the Women in Finance Charter to monitor the progress being made by the signatories. She's also chair of the Women in Finance Charter Industry Board. Yasmin, please, over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Can you hear me loud and clear? Great.
Yes, we can.
Okay, just checking. I'm just going to turn on my screen share. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. And as Julia said, my name is Yasmin Chinwalla. I'm a partner at New Financial. We're a think tank, and we work with Treasury to monitor the progress of signatories to the Women in Finance Charter. Julia's already introduced a little bit about what the Charter is, but I think I'll expand on that a little bit as I speak. So I am going to be talking about the impact of the Charter 4.5 years since launch. So it launched in March of 2016 at the Bank of England. And I remember being there and thinking, this is it was really genuinely exciting moment. So it's been running now for 4.5 years. What is the impact of the Charter? So let's go back and think about what did it set out to achieve. So if you can see this slide on the strategic aims, they were really about, this is a commitment by Treasury and signatory firms to work together to build a more balanced and fair industry. Okay, so building a more balanced and fair industry. And the sort of second overarching aim that I pull out is the Charter reflects the government's aspiration to see gender balance at all levels across financial services firms. So 4.5 years on, I would say largely yes to the first part, that Treasury and signatory firms work together to build a more balanced and fair industry. But are we seeing that aspiration to gender balance? I think no. And I'm going to come to a bit, I'm going to sort of give a bit more context on that as we go through. So I'm just going to start off with really what are the clear successes of the Charter? What do we think? Yes, that has driven change. We can see that change. We can feel that change. The Charter in and of itself, it started from scratch. So in terms of reach on that, when at launch, there were 7 signatories. And now we're at more than 370 signatories. And that's nearly 1 million employees across the UK. That's a big deal. And it's all those signatories, a lot of them, they're all the big household names in there. There are lots of smaller ones as well, but all the big household names are there, which is a real sign of credibility. You've got the likes of your BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley's, the high street banks that everybody would recognize, RBS, HSBC, Barclays, all those companies, they're all there. And I think that that is very much a sort of a mark of the credibility and how seriously the Charter is being taken. And we also see that, I think another sign of that credibility and integrity is the high level of annual reporting. Everyone reports, pretty much. I mean, there's just a handful that for various reasons don't report on an annual basis. But that reporting comes into us, the compliance is good, and the quality has improved every year. And again, about that credibility point, signatories are proud to be signatories. And Vivian, who's speaking after me, is from a signatory firm, and I hope she will expand on a little on that point as well. And I think it's something that the signatory firms, they themselves take seriously, they believe in it, and they are using it as a tool to drive change. Another area is accountability. So one of the being a Charter signatory has really ensured that gender diversity is not only a recurrent gender item, but a prioritized one. And again, I think this is something that Vivian will speak to when she speaks after me. And by having this accountability mechanism within the framework of the Charter, it's creating both a collective and individual responsibility and accountability for gender diversity. And we definitely see that through the reporting. And I think another big area of success for the Charter is if we can view the Charter beyond its remit. So the Charter is called the Women in Finance Charter. So it's focused on women in finance, and it's specifically within that, it's female representation in senior management roles. But beyond its remit, we can see that it sparked similar charters in other sectors. For example, there's a Women in Aviation, there's the others have fallen out of my head, I do apologize. There's various sectors that have modeled the Charter, and in other countries. And I personally have been involved in many discussions with different finance ministries about what they might be doing around the Charter. So that discussion is very active, and the UK has led on it. The Treasury has led. Again, beyond its remit, the key principles are now being applied to other diversity strands, and it's really prompting discussion and action in other diversity strands. It's provided a framework for other diversity strands. So it's not just focused on, whereas obviously the Charter itself is about women, the framework of it has been applied elsewhere. And I think Treasury certainly think that it's internally, they believe this is their most successful voluntary initiative ever. So I think it's viewed widely as a success. And I must clarify there that I in no way represent Treasury, and I don't speak for Treasury. I work very closely with Treasury, and I certainly have a good knowledge of how Treasury works on the Charter, but I do not represent Treasury. So how does the Charter work? I'm just going to take you back to the 4 principles of the Charter, which are having a senior executive responsible and accountable for gender diversity, setting internal targets for gender diversity in senior management, publishing progress annually against those targets, and linking senior executive pay to those targets. And the reason that I've gone back to, I'm taking you through this again, is that I want you to think about what it was like go back in your mind to March 2016. Or indeed, if you think about the summer of 2015, which is when the Guardian Review was putting together their findings. So the Guardian Review was called the Empowering Productivity Review, and it was led by Dame Jane Ann Gardier, who was at the time CEO of Virgin Money. And she was asked by the government, a Conservative government. It's, I think, important to remember that it was a Conservative government, and it was a productivity agenda. The report was called Empowering Productivity, and it was actually a follow-on from it was in a way a follow-on from the 2010 Davis Review, which again was linked to productivity. The Davis Review, which was trying to increase female representation on boards, was about it was one of the 5 identified drivers of economic growth for the UK, was to increase female representation in the labour force. And so the Guardian Review was a follow-on from that. And when the Guardian Review, they spent a lot of time speaking to so many different people, getting so many different viewpoints from across the industry, from across all the stakeholders of the industry. And they came up with these 4 principles. And I don't know if any of you recall, but back in December 2015, when they sort of they did a soft launch of the review, and there was an event at Number 11, and there was some reporting of that event where they said, this is what we're going to put in this review, these 4 principles. And it was absolute shock horror. And the people there was pretty much universal pushback against the idea of targets, the idea of a link to pay for gender diversity targets. And how can we report publicly on this? This is highly sensitive internal information. We're losing competitive advantage. Every single excuse you could think of. And I think it's really important to remember that is the environment into which the Charter launched, because now we take all these things for granted. We have so much more transparency. We have so much more engagement at senior level. And we have diversity is treated as a business priority. And I think a big part of that is that the Charter introduced a business-like framework for achieving a goal in the language of business. And I know that is certainly what Jane Ann had set out to achieve with the recommendations, which then became the Charter, which Treasury adopted. And it was truly groundbreaking. And I think it's easy for us to forget that. Because where we are now is so different from where we were only that short 4.5 years ago. And I think the Charter has been part of and drove a huge shift in the backdrop to why diversity is important to financial services, and a cultural normalization of the presence of women in senior roles. And these, to me, are the clear successes of the Charter. I'm not going to go into great detail around what I think the sort of flaws or failures might be in the nitty gritty. I just want to touch on one, which is that I think a sort of a criticism that's widely leveled at the Charter, and it hasn't ever been said to me personally whenever I've represented the Charter, but I understand where this sentiment comes from. Which is that the Charter is about middle-class white women. It's not a broad diversity initiative. And that is something that Treasury understands, that we understand as their data partner. And this year, for the first time, we've added some questions into this annual update submissions form, which are going to be staying within the remit of the Charter, which is female representation in senior management, but it's looking at other diversity strands within that group of women in senior management. So going back very briefly to that idea of aspiration of gender balance, and I don't think we've really achieved that aim. We haven't achieved that aim. I think is the short answer. We're a long way from that. And I'm going to give you very, very, very quick zip through the highlights from the annual review that support that. And this is literally going to be 20 seconds. So female representation is moving in the right direction. You can see that on this slide. And sort of around three quarters of signatories, and there are about 187 in this reporting sample. 3/4 of signatories, they have increased the proportion of women. They have increased or maintained the proportion of women they have in senior management. 4 out of 5 signatories have met or are on track to meet their targets. That's all great. And a third have actually already met them. But that translates into 1 percentage point a year. That's an increase of 1 percentage point a year. So we're currently at 32% for this cohort of 187 signatories. Now, there are many, many reasons for that you could view as glacial change. And I think it's summed up in this one final, and I think we're going to be talking about a lot of those reasons in the discussion coming. And I'm happy to, I'd be interested to hear all of you attendees listening and watching what your views are on this. But I think it can be summed up in this chart, this final chart. Only 14% of signatories have a 50-50 target. So if we're talking about an aspiration of gender balance, that's not what it has not yet materialized within the Charter. So I hope that provides some food for thought and a view of what next steps might look like. Back to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, and that certainly provides food for thought. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Vivienne Aarts, who's the President of Women in Banking and Finance. Vivienne is the Chief Privacy Officer at Refinitiv, if I said that right. I don't know if I did. There we go. Not sure we have it here in Australia, I mean. Leads the Global Privacy Office, and she's overseeing their global privacy strategy and practice. Vivienne is a recognised gender champion and leader and has previously been awarded the Champion for Women Achievement Award at the Women in Banking and Finance Awards. So please, Vivienne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Julia. And hello, everybody. Really lovely to be here. What I can't resist, and I think just to lighten the mood a little bit, is a bit of a celebration. So if I could just say well done to Citi and well done to RBS. Citi announced yesterday the first female CEO of a Wall Street bank, Jane Fraser, who when I was at Citi was an absolute inspiration. I'm a great fan of Jane Fraser, and I'm so pleased that she's now the CEO of Citi. And of course, Alison Rose in the UK, the first female CEO as well. And the reason I give them a shout out is not only because of their achievement, but also they are fantastic Women in Banking and Finance members and have been for many years. Yasmin, just to pick up on the Women in Finance Charter, I think that was actually an incredible moment, and I agree. Refinitiv is one of the sponsors and one of the earliest signatories of the Women in Finance Charter. But I think one of the biggest impacts of the Women in Finance Charter, from my perspective, certainly, is that it has given permission to organizations to really address this issue at the most senior level. So in the same way that the Me Too movement gave us permission to actually call out sexual discrimination, or otherwise we were told that we were being too sensitive or unrealistic, or actually it was really all in your mind, or really we don't do that sort of thing. Actually, with the Women in Finance Charter, because it was adopted at such the senior level and because it had such amazing political backing. I mean, Nicky Morgan was an absolute tigress when it came to the Women in Finance Charter in terms of meeting with the banks to encourage them to see the light on this issue. And it has actually had a very significant impact in terms of opening up the debate at the most senior levels. So where do we go from here? I think the Women in Finance Charter has been a hugely impactful, as I said, but also the gender pay gap reporting, which is increasingly prevalent in lots of different countries. And it shines a light on the reality and the facts. And what it does, I think, is it de-emotionalizes the situation. It removes opinions from the situation, and we can actually start to deal with the data, which I think is far more empowering and impactful. as president of Women in Banking and Finance, I get the opportunity to speak with and see many of our members at the most senior level as well, and to hear from them what are the issues and what are their concerns. And one of the things I found is that there's very little traction in talking about equality, but there is an awful lot of traction in talking about the business case. And if you can't win their hearts, you can certainly win their minds when you start to discuss the business case. And the business case is that, frankly, companies are more profitable when they are diverse and inclusive. I understand a McKinsey study indicated that if you had a diverse and inclusive leadership, one could realize up to 1/3 higher profits in that particular organization. And we all know the McKinsey data point from 2015, where they said that we could realize 12 million increase in global GDP by 2025 if we actually achieved a narrowing of that gender gap as well. We also know, in terms of the business case, that diverse and inclusive organizations are less likely to fail. And there is also better morale and a far more productive workforce in a diverse and inclusive organization. So the business case is very much there. But the other argument I think that works incredibly well is the talent issue. Understanding that actually, if you're only going to be recruiting from a very small pond, then you are fighting for the same talent and you're going to be digging at the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. Whereas actually, if you cast your net a lot wider and you consider the talent that is out there that you haven't realized, women are 50% of the population, the talent argument becomes very, very real. So it's both a talent opportunity in order to achieve the breadth of talent that's actually available, but it's also about talent retention. How do you retain that amazing talent internally and attract new talent? It's interesting to see from our members, particularly on our job board, that what we do is we actually profile all of our companies who post jobs, and we ask them to put on their profile, what is your gender pay gap? Have you signed up to the Women in Finance Charter? You know, what data can you give us with regard to diversity and inclusion? Where do you stand in terms of gender inclusivity? And it's organizations that can demonstrate a diverse and inclusive leadership team and genuine commitment to real policies and real actions and real results that are attracting the talent. And it isn't just female talent that they're attracting. They're attracting talent from across the board. So the talent argument, I think, is incredibly impactful. The final point I wanted to make really is around the strategic issue, is getting businesses to understand the strategic importance of having diversity and inclusion. And again, a bit of a shout out here for the CEO of Nielsen in the US, who appointed himself the head of D&I, recognizing that diversity and inclusion is so critical to business strategy that it needed to sit with the CEO to make sure that it was done. I think one of the objectives of the Women in Finance Charter, by requiring an executive to be responsible, is to achieve that same effect, which it is about accountability. So when I became president of Women in Banking and Finance, I went around my members. I said, what are the two things, or what are the any things that are really bothering you? And one of them was, we're putting a lot of time and effort and money into our gender programs, but we're not making any progress. And then the second one was, we're really concerned about the talent pipeline. A lot of focus on bringing in, equal levels of men and women at the junior end, a lot of focus on the senior level, but really struggling in the middle, both keeping the talent and then finding more talent as well. It's proving to be, a considerable issue. So interestingly, having unpicked that a little bit, one of the things that we've been speaking with our members about is actually, do you and where do you put responsibility for gender and diversity and inclusion more generally? And those organizations that are parking it within HR, are parking it somewhere in the middle of the organization, are parking it with an employees network, are indeed parking the issue for good, and they are not making progress. Those organizations which have accepted that it is a business issue, a talent issue, a strategic issue, have parked it with a senior executive team where it doesn't stay parked. It has to move, where it's actually accountable and it's measurable and they're actually making an impact. So that was the first bit, and we've been talking with our members about how that can actually work and how that happens and how you can be much more effective. So don't stick a budget halfway down the organization and hope a miracle will happen. Take it to senior leadership and get them to own it and deal with it, as the case may be. And the second one really is on that talent pipeline. I think we do focus, and rightly so, on the pipeline coming in and on the senior levels as well, in terms of senior executives and board level positions, but we can't ignore the middle. And I think we ignore the middle often in two ways. I think we ignore the managers in the middle who don't necessarily buy in to diversity and inclusion because they're struggling to see why it is useful to them, what is the impact for them. And I think we also aren't focusing on what it is that are the challenges in that mid part of the career that is causing our talent to leave. We're actually starting we launched it today, a research project at Women in Banking and Finance to focus on that specific piece, which we hope to share with our members next year to help them to address that particular issue. But it's an issue that's been around for a while and has been identified for a while. And what we really need is some data on that in order to make some progress. Which leads me to my next point, which is about data. Businesses have lots of data about what they need to do in their businesses and to be successful. What we don't have enough of now is data in relation to diversity and inclusion. What's excellent is to see events like this, to see reports like the one Eleva has now produced, and to see the amount of information that is increasingly being collected by organizations, but it falls far short of the same sort of data that is being collected for business purposes. And I think that is a massive realignment which organizations need to embrace, which is if you're serious about diversity and inclusion, if you get the business argument, if you get the talent issue, if you get the strategic piece, then you will also understand the importance of investing in getting the data, actually collecting it so you can understand what is your current landscape, and then you can plan how do you make those specific interventions in order to deal with your areas where you are slightly more challenged. So I love the mantra, what gets measured gets done. And with the data, we can start measuring that to make sure that it does get done. And we need to make some progress on that. I think we had a mention there of a couple of 100-year anniversaries. We have reached a point where we have achieved, I suppose, a number of very significant anniversaries. Recently, we had the 100-year anniversary of women being given the vote, 100-year anniversary, I'm a solicitor, of women being allowed to practice law, 100-year anniversary of women being allowed to participate in the military. 100 years ago, there was a huge leap and significant progress with regard to gender equality. But 100 years later, it's embarrassing to see where we are. And the data suggests that it will take yet another 100 years before, at the current rate of change, before we actually achieve parity, until we actually achieve the goals, which is just 50-50 that we're seeking. And frankly, none of us will be around for that. And it's far too far in the future. And none of us have got the patience for that. So my suggestion in order to move this forward is that COVID-19 has presented us with a lot of challenges, but also has presented us with some unique opportunities because it has accelerated or demonstrated how we can accelerate change when we have to and when we need to. So during COVID-19, a lot of the myths around flexible working have actually been dispelled, which is fantastic. I don't like linking gender to flexible working as an inevitable tie, but it is absolutely a feature of it. And the reason it's a feature of it is because the structure of our society, the structure around how we've built where people live and where people work, and how we've structured our organizations has been tested to the max. And we've actually shown that actually we don't necessarily need that in-person presenteeism. Perhaps those structured hours aren't exactly what is absolutely necessary either. And so we've also had the experience of bringing the whole of your life and work to the office as well. So people have been at home without any infrastructure. And I know that the studies have indicated that women have been picking up far more of the domestic burden than men have, but men have been picking up that responsibility as well, and realizing that it is a real one, that it has to be addressed, and that it does take time, both physical time and emotional energy as well. And I think that realization is resetting priorities, and resetting what is valued as well in society. And so I would suggest that we can take those learnings from this experience, which has impacted women more significantly than men, and actually seize the opportunity to recreate how we work in future and how we achieve that balance. We have the opportunity to restructure and to rewrite what work looks like, and to make an exponential change in the financial services sector, and not one that's going to take 100 years for us to get there, but one that hopefully, perhaps in even 12 to 24 months, as the COVID-19 virus hopefully is overcome, we can actually start making a difference. So I'll finish there with that challenge, but I think it is a very realistic one, and one which it is ours for the taking if we so choose to do it.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got a lot of questions coming in, and some of them are actually quite factual questions. So I'm just going to get some quick answers if I can. Yasmin, I think this will be for you. One question is just a straight. What percentage of the industry is the 370 signatories? What percentage?
It's difficult. It's kind of how what the universe of the industry is. What's your definition is a very, very broad one. If you think of the industry as being the regulated entities, there's 5,000 or so regulated firms, and we've got 370. But you have to remember there's probably a very, very, very long, thin tail. And if you think about how the culture of the industry is by and large defined, not in terms of numbers, but by the biggest players, all the big players are in the charter. So I think that in terms of coverage, the Treasury is satisfied that they're currently, maybe this is the way to think about it, that currently the Treasury is not in a phase of a sort of very active recruitment. The first phase of the charter was much more about, we need to get more companies signed up. And right now it's more about, how do we get those signed up to push themselves harder on their goals?
And there's another question, which is how much play is there in the terminology senior management? There's a reflection that that terminology is used in quite different ways in different companies.
So I saw that question from Tracy. Hi, Tracy. Yes, there's no question of that. I think again, it's about what has driven the success of the charter. I think that the big element of that is that it was a voluntary charter, and that it allowed companies to choose for themselves how they wanted to take on this responsibility. So it was asking them to take on the responsibility, and it was also alongside that was, you choose how to do it. So I don't know if the next steps for the charter, I think it would be a massive change of goalpost if the next steps were to be more constrictive in what a definition of senior management looks like. And as per the question, yes, absolutely, there is a huge variety in definitions of senior management. But we do see trends, and I think that part of that is to do with the maturity of companies. On this agenda, we see the clear lines of, okay, there's a block that does this, there's a block that does this, and there's a block that does this. So the thematically overall, there's always a cohort that matches. So they might not all be the same across the board, but there are those cohorts within that. There's sort of subsections within the cohort that match. But I think that the biggest part of my role is in producing the data analysis is providing transparency on what that looks like. And what Treasury then is doing is using that analysis to apply pressure to companies around, especially when there's companies seeking to change their definitions of senior management, saying, are you sure that this is the right way to do it? Are you sure this is your definition? So it's not going to stop them, but it's going to challenge back to them. And I think that we certainly have thrown down that gauntlet in the research and saying, look at this data set. Are you an outlier? Is that what you want to be? In financial services, we're incredibly competitive, right? So if you're in the bottom third or in the bottom 2/3, is that where you really want to be? No, you want to be in the top third. And what does it take to be in the top third? And then that becomes a self-perpetuating cycle.
And we do have an audience that is broader than the UK, and a question coming in about what, if any, plans are there for something like the Charter to go into other countries?
So there are some international charters where they have sort of used the model of this charter. I don't want to sort of go into huge detail here, but I think if we look at what has driven the success of this charter, one was the voluntary element. Secondly, the collaboration, the sort of partnership between government through Treasury and industry. And I think the third part of that was the backing of government. And I think and we've certainly seen this, I've seen this through some of the other sector charters within the UK, for example. It was the government that really drove the Women in Finance Charter in the UK, and that is why it was successful and got all the big firms to sign up. So if you want that success, that is what you have to do. And when Helena Morrissey started the 30% Club, she wrote to every FTSE 100 chair and said, would you please get involved with this? She got a handful of responses, and she jumped on them and got them to start talking to their other chair friends. And that's how you can create the momentum that you need. So I don't think it's necessarily sort of a role for Treasury in the UK to be dictating how another country or another sector might pick up this remit, but we can certainly learn from what we know has driven the success of this particular charter, I think.
And I'm going to broaden out now from that sort of set of factual questions and say, clearly the Charter has achieved some things, and it is fantastic to have it and to learn about the history, about how much shock there was when the initial principles came out. And here we are all these years later, and firms are in a competitive race to do the right thing and to be seen to be doing the right thing by the Charter. But with all of that, we're still seeing quite a slow rate of change. So I just will throw it open to the whole panel. You know, what do we need to do, particularly in the era we're living in now, to get firms to lift ambition so that they're not setting targets that are at the sort of 1/3 range? They are genuinely pursuing a strategy of 50%. I'm happy to throw that to anybody.
Oh, I'll pick that one up.
Sure.
I think that it's been interesting to see during COVID-19 that actually D&I hasn't fallen off the agenda. And I think that demonstrates a very significant change in the attitudes of businesses that wasn't there, I would suggest, 10 years ago at all. You know, during the financial crisis, people just cut their D&I budgets. You know, it would be nice to have, whatever. But this time around with COVID-19, there has been a tremendous focus on people and talent and diversity and inclusion, and it hasn't been a struggle to keep it on the agenda. Everyone's under pressure for lots of different reasons, but it hasn't been a struggle to keep it on the agenda. But where we go to next, particularly in terms of the Women in Finance Charter, I think is something that does need to be thought about quite carefully. And I think we should perhaps consider what other levers can we pull. So one of the areas that is growing so very quickly within the financial services sector is environmental and ESG investing. So to think about, you know, the S in ESG is about social, the sustainability goals that deal with diversity and inclusion, that we should be focusing on those as firms are looking at being much more purpose-driven and being much more transparent with their employees and their customers about how they're run and how they are being ethical in what they do. And a very significant part of that is their culture and demonstrating diversity and inclusion. So I think often when you're going up one path and you may have exhausted as far as you can go. I think it's really important to think about what else is there out there that supports this ambition and the the right to equality. And I think ESG is where we're able to find a voice, an expression, and an avenue in order to make further progress on this issue.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, please.
So I think in many ways we go about this slightly the wrong way quite often, in that I've had a long career in banking before transitioning to academia, and we try to get women to fit into the current culture in financial services. And I think that is a big problem. It's actually because the culture of financial services was built back in the day when it was built by alpha male for alpha male clients. And that's not the market today. But we're still trying to address women's lack of confidence, women's the imposter. We're trying to address crying in the office. We're trying to address all of those things as if they're wrong with the women, instead of thinking about how financial services needs to be reshaped for the future. And I think that would be a really important cultural change. And also looking at the language that's used. Because the language, I mean, why is an investor who likes to have high returns called aggressive, for example? All of those things need to be looked at to make it an environment that is palatable for women to work and for women to be clients.
Oh, could I just support that enormously and just say that it's about fixing the system and not fixing the women. And we just need to move forward and get on with that. And I think there's some interesting developments that we've seen, particularly around some of our membership. So Standard Life Aberdeen earlier this year launched parental leave. Oh, what a relief. Parental leave, not maternity, not paternity, but parental leave, recognizing that, that gender delineation, or while maternity and paternity is absolutely fantastic, but it brings with it so much social and unconscious bias and expectations as well. And just by changing the language, you can change the perception enormously. And I thought that was just a tremendous move forward. And there's all those other practical things as well. I mean, one of the things I always do is I won't is looking at, I always question rather, at conferences when they have, an all male panel, everyone looks the same. It's like, wow, where are you people coming from? You need to remember that your audience is diverse and you need to be inclusive and diverse as well. So, reach out and challenge those conferences where everyone looks the same, and suggest that they do things differently, because actually that's the way the world is moving forward. But yes, I think it's all about fixing the system and not the women. And I think we've got that opportunity now, as we sit as a society on the cusp of significant structural change.
Can I just add a point on the COVID?
Yes.
Yes. So I just published a piece looking at the impact of COVID on the D&I agenda quite specifically. And we're about to publish a big piece next week, in fact, looking at why we think COVID is it's certainly an opportunity to drive some pretty radical action. There's sort of two things here. One is in terms of sort of going back to Julia's question, or whoever, sorry, the attendee that asked the question via Julia, what can drive that shift up to that parity goal? This COVID crisis, it wasn't a financial crisis. The last crisis was a financial crisis. So it was an existential crisis for the industry. This is a health and safety crisis. At its heart, it is a health and safety crisis. Health and safety diversity sits within, it's a complement to health and safety. It is part of health and safety. They are integral to each other. And well-being generally sits under diversity as well. Diversity, who would have thought that diversity and areas of diversity and inclusion, for example, flexible working and having your staff equipped for flexible working, would be a critical business continuity issue? Nobody, I can tell you that, not one. There was not one company that thought that thought. And now, if you don't think that, you're an utter moron, to be honest. I mean, come on, where have you been? So these are really, really, we're in such an interesting phase right now where this transition of how diversity and inclusion are viewed is completely turned on its head. It is actually fundamental to that business continuity, to that business resilience, and is being pulled further and further into the strategic core of operations. And that, I am very hopeful, is going to be significant, and we'll see the impacts on driving some of these really big issues that need to change around culture, expectations. And the second part, the second point that I would like to make is there's always been a spectrum on this topic, always. So if we look at, I can tell you through the Women in Finance Charter, I can tell you through every piece of research that I've ever done. I speak to so many people across this industry, and there are some who are at, this end, they're the beginners, and there are some who are at that end, and many, many in between at every phase. And there are those who kind of get it, but maybe are a little bit slow. There are those that totally get it and are completely on it. There are those that sort of like, oh yeah, we'll do that in a few years' time. That's not for us. We don't need that yet. We're not big enough, or we're not, that's just not part of our way of thinking. We're a meritocracy, whatever the reason. Those that were slightly behind before this crisis hit are going to get even further behind if they don't act, because those who were ahead before the crisis hit are going to leap ahead, further ahead. So that I think that there's going to be the potential with any crisis, you have winners and you have losers. And if you don't get on this agenda, you are far more likely to be in that loser bucket than in the winner bucket. And the winner bucket will see those benefits. And I think that's a very substantial shift in thinking around where the diversity agenda sits within business.
We had a discussion there about, is it about fixing the structures, fixing the women, and all agreed that it's about structural and cultural change. But we've got some very direct questions from Fiona about whether in part it's about changing the men. So she points particularly in the asset management industry to men who talk the right talk, but aren't changing their conduct on the investment floor. And they aren't the kind of businesses that are in the charter. They're in the asset management sector. They tend to be mid-cap asset management firms or private equity. If we can just take that question on, I mean, clearly a lot of what we've talked about has been analytical about businesses signing the charter, then doing the data, the reporting, the setting of goals, but what's the drill through into interpersonal behaviours and cultures? How do we make sure that that's changing at the same time?
Can I pick that up to start with, please? So this is a really, really important point, because it's easy to apply a box ticking exercise and look at this from a boxing point of view. Like Vivienne said earlier, the business case is a very strong one, and that can be used for companies. Now, if you have a CEO who signs up to a D&I policy within the firm, but doesn't make sure that it's lived throughout the organization, it's worth nothing. In fact, it can work against the firm, because you can see this becomes like, oh, look, we told you so it wasn't going to work. Or you place a woman in a position, you create a position for a woman, you place her there, you don't give her the adequate support or training or possibilities to advance, then she will fail in that position. And then again, you will re-emphasize that it doesn't work. So it has to be throughout the organization. You have to make sure that each and every employee lives the values, and it has to come from senior leadership down.
Thank you. So anybody else want to comment on that cultural piece?
I think it's very much, again, on the data side, which is, when you say what you're going to do, but nobody measures you and holds you accountable, then you'll get away with all sorts. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is around how do we hold our businesses accountable for what they've actually stated that they will achieve. And I don't think you can go around changing people. When you can change hearts and minds, that's absolutely wonderful. But I don't think we should be expecting to go and change people. People don't change. They'll still have their attitudes and such like. But what we can do is call out behaviors. And what we can do is intervene when those behaviors are having a negative impact, and the data can show us when that is the case, so that the appropriate actions can be taken accordingly. So again, I think just taking a step back and making firms much more accountable for what's going on, and then analyzing what the data is and recognizing what behaviors are causing those results, and then to adjust or to address them accordingly is very much the way to go. But we can't change people. They're going to say and think what they think, but we can certainly change how they behave and the impact thereof.
Thank you. I can see time growing short. Sorry, Yasmin.
So I was just going to say, so in Fiona's question was sort of specifically around the asset management industry, and there's a glass houses argument there that if the asset management industry is trying to hold their investee companies to account around diversity and inclusion, but yet they are entirely male dominated, and I think that's across the board in financial services. Yes, there is a glass houses argument on 100%, and I've done a lot of research around the asset management industry, but I also think that it's a matter of there's always going to be aspects of following the money, right? So what are the levers that are going to work for your organization? For some, it's we need to be seen. We're a really, really huge public retail bank. Everybody knows our name. We can't not be part of this. Otherwise, the government's going to, poop on our heads from a great height. For some of these small firms, what's the lever for them? It's who's putting money in their pocket. And that is a shift that is much slower to happen, but it is beginning to happen. And we're beginning to see the signs of the big institutional investors who are beginning to bring diversity criteria into how they award their mandates, into their RFP process, into their tendering processes. And I think separate to COVID, but potentially accelerated, catalyzed by COVID, the whole shift of big data and how we use big data to be able to show us these trends, and which the environment agenda has been very, very smart about, and has been able to create a real red alert in a way that the gender agenda has not yet. But I think that potentially with the way that we look at data and how those baskets and baskets of data translate into what is impactful in diversity and inclusion, I am hopeful that we are on the brink of being able to translate and be able to crucially quantify the risk attached to not doing all this stuff, because there is opportunity cost here, and the likes of McKinsey can only measure it, to be honest, I think sort of pretty much at the margin. And it is so wholesale. Diversity is a matrix, it's not a silo. So it's so difficult to measure what that opportunity cost is, but big data, I think, will allow us to do that. And I'm hopeful, Fiona, that in the asset management industry, that will be the catalyst that is going to really drive a huge change, though that might not necessarily translate into more women on the investment floor, I'm afraid, yet.
In the couple of minutes we've got left, I'm just going to do one whiz through the panel, and just for your last takeaway message for the audience listening, what's one thing perhaps they can do that would make a difference? One thing to ask for, one thing to try and implement in their workplace. Ilva, I'll start with you. It might be about putting more women forward to speak to the media, by the sound of it from the statistics.
I think for the women out there in the audience and anyone who listens later on, I would like to put to you to challenge the imposter. It's scary to put yourself out there, but do it anyway. The more you do it, the less scary it becomes. For the men out there, I would like to ask you to please raise your expectations about the women in business. Women are great at business. Their perceived lack of confidence is good for business. It's overconfidence that is killing the financial services industry.
Thank you. Vivian, last takeaway message?
Oh, there's so many, aren't there? I would say be brave and ask the question. So diversity is what we look like. And next time you're invited onto a panel, ask them, is this what we want to look like? And then inclusion is about how we feel. And next time there's a new policy or a process or a change in the organization, ask the question, is this including everyone? Is this making us feel right? So I just ask the question. You don't have to be the leader on the white horse at the front, but if you ask the question, you can get people to pause and think about what the right answer should be, and hopefully it's the diverse and inclusive one.
Thank you. Yasmin.
There are lots of questions that come in through Q&A about sort of specific pointers on how do we drive this, how do we drive change. Please do take a look at the Women in Finance Charter and Review. We published it in June. If you just hit Google and Women in Finance Charter, it will come up. It's on the government's website. There are 5 pages of qualitative analysis of best practice and what that looks like and there will be something in there for any size firm at any stage of maturity on this agenda. And there are so many different areas in that. So that's my one thing, is please look to, you don't have to rethink the wheel here because there's all this stuff is already out there. But secondly, for the individuals in the audience, in terms of, you know, what you yourself can do, I know this is a women in banking and finance audience largely, right? So you're all women. Ask to have good quality corporate headshots taken of yourself, because that, I promise you, is a primary factor in when a journalist will use a good quote from you or not. And if you don't have good quality photography, if you have a crappy picture that is taken on your iPhone or is your security ID photo, because I was a journalist for many years and I saw those too, you are doing yourself a massive disservice. And by asking that question and asking all the other senior women or even mid-level women in your organization to do that, it will hopefully be a big kick up the backside for your press team, for your comms and strategy people in your organization to take that seriously and completely change the data in Ilva's report next time she runs it.
Thank you. Plenty of good ideas there and very practical suggestions. I've seen that the questions are coming in thick and fast. My apologies, we were only able to get to so many, but that has been a terrific discussion. Thank you, thank you, thank you to the wonderful panel. I very much enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I look forward to joining you again for further conversations through the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.